I was what was called a bombs and rockets person when I first came to academia. I studied defense policy and weapons procurement and the congressional politics, and with the end of the Cold War, that seemed like if I was going to continue, was going to have to retool, and was looking for some new project, some new interest. And it was about the time that Bill Clinton got elected and inaugurated in 1993, and every day I would pick up the New York Times and it would be executive order this and proclamation that, and a letter that he had written and reversed policy. And I had always, undergraduates are taught the Neustadt model of presidential power, where presidents have to bargain to get what they want, and presidents can't get their way by command. And I started seeing examples of presidents doing just that, saying do this, do that, and it actually happens. So I thought that was curious. Began doing some exploratory work and found that there was basically nothing that had been written on it. And the more I got into it, the deeper I dove into the subject. It got more and more interesting. And so the questions that came to mind were, why do presidents issue executive orders? What are they? How can presidents use them to obtain their policies and to get their preferences enacted? And that led to sort of side trips into the legal literature, which is very different from social science, talking about the legal basis and constitutional basis of these things. Gave me a chance to look at the congressional literature, how presidents deal with Congress, and began over the course of a year or two to formulate a research agenda that was designed to look at the conditions under which presidents issue executive orders, what they try to accomplish with these unilateral actions, and what they actually mean to the contemporary presidency. Most of the actual research involved going to the presidential libraries. Each president, when they leave office, their papers go to some repository, and it's wherever the president wishes to build the library. Clinton's is in Little Rock. Eisenhower has his in his childhood home of Abilene, Kansas. They're spread all over the country, and in those archives you have copies of correspondence and papers, and these days electronic correspondence, emails, and you're able to piece together discussions that members of the president's staff had about particular issues, not just limited to executive orders. And so that's, in the course of doing that research, I visited about 7 or 8 presidential libraries. Really found it fascinating to look at the way that presidents' own staff, their staffs viewed these things as an instrument that the president could use to get their way, and was able to reconstruct discussions in the flow of thinking, and put together a story, tell a story behind a particular executive order that confirmed my initial expectation that these instruments were more important than anybody had thought, that presidents had long viewed them as a critical resource, and that political scientists had, we had not caught up to what presidents actually did. One of the difficult things about studying executive orders is the record keeping was pretty shoddy. You would have pieces of paper that emerged in an executive branch agency, and there was no systematic record keeping until about 1905, and it wasn't until 1906 or 1936 when the Federal Register was started, the daily digest of all federal government actions, which is where we now have a comprehensive and authoritative record of all executive branch actions, whether it's an executive order or a proclamation or a letter to an executive branch head or a military order or anything. And one of the reasons the register came into being had to do with a Supreme Court case in which the government was prosecuting a Texas oil producer for violating an executive order that no longer existed. It had actually been rescinded, but nobody knew it because the record-keeping processes were so shoddy that the night before oral argument before the Supreme Court, some Justice Department lawyers realized that they didn't have a case because the law that they were prosecuting this man for had actually been rescinded. And so they had to do what they could to kind of walk back, and it was fiascos like that that led to the establishment of this register so that everybody would know what the federal government was doing. I mean, this had been during the rise of the New Deal when the government had grown so quickly that it was just, as a physical matter, difficult to keep track of what the government was doing. There have been about 10,000 executive orders issued over the course of the time period that I was studying, and in the decades since, there have been probably another 600 or 700 issued. I drew a sample from that. Obviously, I didn't have the capability to go through and read and research and do a history of every one, but I drew a statistically valid sample, a random sample, and did a detailed case history of each of the orders in the sample and was able to classify them in terms of subject matter, and most importantly, establish some criteria that I used to determine whether an order was significant. Executive orders and other unilateral actions come across the full range of significance. There are orders that establish commissions to recommend revisions to the American nuclear force posture, which are pretty important. There are also executive orders that tell federal employees they can take the afternoon of December 24th off. Not so important. And so you need to know, I thought it was useful to know which one of these orders were important, what percentage. And it turns out that about 1 in 6 involved what I thought was an important issue, and the rest of them were relatively minor. And then did some regression analysis to determine, I knew how many executive orders the president issued in any month, and we were able to get information on lots of other indicators: the president's popularity, majorities in Congress, state of the economy, whether we were in election year, beginning or end of a president's term, and ran some regression techniques to see what were the underlying causal factors behind the issuance of executive orders. And we found, not it was what we expected, that unpopular presidents tend to issue more executive orders because they often will have more difficulty convincing Congress to do what they want, and they still continue they need to show that they're active in governing. You see a spate of executive orders at the beginning of a president's term. When they come in the first month, they put their stamp on policy. You see a jump in executive orders at the end of a president's term, especially when there's going to be a party change. And all of these indicators fed back into the original expectation that if these things were truly trivial, that they didn't have any substantive meaning, there'd be no reason to see these jumps, and there'd be no reason for the orders to vary with where we were in a president's term or whether there was an election. The fact that they did move in those kinds of ways suggests very strongly that there is a substantive component. For example, one of the first orders that Obama issued, I think it was on his first or second full day in office, was to order the closure of Guantanamo using a military order. It didn't specify that Guantanamo was hereby closed, but it did specify that within a year he expected it to be closed. And that was important because it was a major campaign promise, and it was a way of establishing right away that he was using the powers of office to make policy that was consistent with his campaign rhetoric. And here we are, almost 2 years later, it's still not closed, which it's a different set of problems. But clearly this was an example of a president relying on the powers of unilateral action to make a statement of policy. And that's something that all presidents do. I think the most surprising finding was how much of a jump we saw at the end of the term during that transition, when the president has either lost or, in the case of Bill Clinton, they can't run for a third term, and so they know that a new president is coming in. They know the president is going to be of the opposite party, and so in a case like that, the normal accountability mechanisms that are designed to constrain the behavior of political officials are gone because there are no political consequences. So in Clinton's case, issued a number of environmental regulations, the whole spate of controversial pardons, which is another example of unilateral action, and the consistency of that pattern I thought was a little bit of a surprise, because you really do see a mad scramble in those last 10 weeks. People know that they're going to be out of office on January 20th, and everything that they've been trying to do and have been having trouble maybe because they can't shake the bureaucratic rust off the processes. They do their best to get them in place before they have to leave office. I think it helps in two ways. One is that it shows that presidents don't have to bargain to get a lot of what they want. Now, obviously, there are things that presidents have to bargain. No president can come into office and, implement sweeping healthcare reform without Congress. I mean, in that sense, the separation of powers really does impose some constraints. But within a sphere of somewhat ambiguous powers, the president does have the authority to impose their preferences, to move the status quo, and leave it up to the courts or to Congress to undo it. And you see that time and time again. It doesn't matter whether it's a contemporary Republican president. It doesn't matter if it's a Whig president from the 1830s. It doesn't matter if it's John Adams with his midnight appointments in 1800. It's a common theme that all presidents engage in, and understanding that, I think, tells us something important, and it really, I think, meshes with the way that presidents and their staffs think about it. The pressure to do so stems from the nature of the office, which is the president is the only nationally elected figure, and the framers opted for a single president as opposed to a council precisely to enhance that accountability. And so even taking George Washington's term, first president, he knew that everything that he did was going to be precedent setting. He issues the Neutrality Proclamation in 1793, declaring that a state of peace exists between the United States and France, and that or a state of peace exists in the war between Great Britain and France, and that's U.S. policy. And many of the Jeffersonians thought that was an egregious overreach, claiming that Congress has the power to declare war, and that what the president does has usurped that in a back doorway by declaring that a state of peace exists. And so in 1793, you had Madison and Hamilton, who 5 years earlier had collaborated on the Federalist Papers, engaging in this public debate about whether Washington had the constitutional authority to do that. In every president, you find examples of unilateral action. James Monroe with the Monroe Doctrine, Lincoln, of course, with the actions taken in the spring of 1861. I can't rattle off examples from every president, but you will indeed find them in every president. And it has to do with the incentives of the office, the pressures of the office, and the fact that even before the advent of modern mass media technologies, that accountability still stopped with the president. It is true that Bush pushed the envelope and was made more controversial by there was an intellectual basis from some of his advisors, particularly people in the Office of Legal Counsel, which is the unit in the Justice Department, which is ostensibly the executive branch's lawyers. And some of those attorneys had promulgated the theory of the unitary executive, which holds that within the sphere of executive branch power, which they read broadly, it is the president and the president alone that has the authority to act, and denied that Congress had any legitimate role. And that was a little bit too much, and they backed away from that, realizing that presented a reading of presidential power that really, I think it's correct to say that taken literally, negated much of the advantages of separation of powers. But if you take the weaker form of that argument, you would have predicted, and I did think that when Obama became president, that he would leave many of those policies in place because they were necessary for the president to maintain control of policy, and indeed many of them have stayed in place. Some have been modified, but the warrantless eavesdropping, there's now a statutory basis for that. The targeted assassinations, the targeted killings of people who are suspected of being members of Al-Qaeda, that policy has continued. So certainly not all, but many of the unilateral policies of the Bush administration continue under Obama. Well, my route to political science was pretty circuitous, with lots of twists and turns. When I started college, I was actually pre-med, and a combination of pre-med and physics, and decided that I didn't think I wanted to spend my life in a laboratory, and was trying to think of what other subjects might interest me, and politics had always been something that I'd found interesting, and was good at the coursework, and was able to use math and the methods part of it, found that very appealing. And so by the end of my undergraduate career, it came down to a choice between going to law school and trying graduate school. I still wasn't quite sure I wanted to be an academic, but was pretty sure I didn't want to be a lawyer. And so I went to grad school, was fortunate to get into a good program, and that's where I made the decision that I wanted to be an academic. Was pretty late in life.